you've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple: subscribe. We're almost at 7,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's dive into today's story. My name is Dr. Vincent Ashford, and what I'm about to tell you will shatter every assumption you've ever held about the nature of consciousness, reality, and the terrible price of seeking knowledge that was never meant for human minds. For 33 years, I've dedicated my existence to investigating phenomena that most academics dismiss as folklore, psychological aberration, or outright fraud. I've walked through asylums where shadows detached themselves from walls and moved with predatory intelligence. I've held artifacts that whispered secrets in languages that predate human speech while burning my flesh with cold that transcended temperature. I've spoken face to face with entities that knew intimate details about my childhood dreams, memories I buried so deeply that I myself had forgotten them. But nothing in those 3 decades of chasing the impossible prepared me for what I discovered in the remote mountains of Romania. What I found there wasn't merely another supernatural entity or archaeological curiosity. It was something that fundamentally rewrote my understanding of consciousness itself, of the nature of existence, of the cosmic forces that shaped reality long before our species learned to make fire. More than that, it was something that nearly cost me everything I valued in this brief, precious span of mortality we call life. This story begins not with my journey to Romania, but in my study on a rain-soaked Thursday evening in October, when the boundary between the known and unknowable grew thin enough for something ancient to reach through. I remember the date with crystalline precision, because it marked the moment my life divided into before and after, into the comfortable ignorance of assumed safety and the terrible knowledge of what waits in the spaces between human understanding. October 15th. The rain drummed against my windows with unusual persistence, creating a rhythmic backdrop that seemed almost hypnotic as I worked through research that had consumed the better part of 6 months. Medieval accounts of demonic possession, Byzantine texts on spiritual warfare, fragments of Gnostic gospels that described reality as a thin shell concealing vast and hungry darkness. My wife Catherine had retreated to bed hours earlier, leaving me alone with my books and the familiar comfort of academic isolation. Our house in Salem, Massachusetts, had been my sanctuary for 15 years, its walls lined with texts that most universities wouldn't permit in their libraries. Books on demonology that scholars pretended didn't exist. Treatises on ancient religious practices that challenged fundamental assumptions about human development. Accounts of supernatural phenomena that straddled the line between anthropology and outright mysticism. I was deep in a particularly disturbing account of 13th century exorcism rituals, cross-referencing claims about non-human intelligence with modern psychological research, when I heard the sound that would change everything. A single deliberate knock at my front door. Not the casual rap of a neighbour or the authoritative bang of law enforcement, but something measured and intentional, as if the knocker was following a precise ritual whose significance I couldn't grasp. The second knock came exactly 10 seconds after the first, then a third, maintaining that precise interval with mechanical consistency. By the fourth knock, I was walking toward the door, my academic curiosity overriding any sensible caution about midnight visitors. But when I opened it, the porch was empty, except for shadows that seemed deeper than the darkness should have allowed. Instead of a person sitting on my doorstep, as if it had materialized from the rain-soaked night itself, was a wooden crate. Old wood, darkened with age and moisture, bound with metal strips that had turned green with oxidation. The craftsmanship was exquisite, in a way that modern manufacturing couldn't replicate, every joint fitted with the precision of someone who understood wood as a living material, rather than mere construction material. There was no delivery truck disappearing down the street, no footprints in the wet leaves that covered my walkway, no evidence that any human being had approached my door. Just the crate, waiting with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. I brought it inside, partly from curiosity, and partly because leaving it on the doorstep felt somehow wrong. Like abandoning a responsibility I didn't understand but couldn't ignore. The moment I set it down in my study, the atmosphere in the room changed dramatically. The air became heavier, more electric, like the pressure that builds before severe thunderstorms. My cats, usually fearless explorers of any new object in their territory, fled to the upstairs bedroom and refused to come down for the rest of the night, hiding under the bed with their pupils dilated in terror. The crate wasn't locked, but the lid was sealed with what appeared to be wax. As I worked to break the seal, I noticed that the wax was carved with symbols so tiny and intricate that I needed a magnifying glass to examine them properly. The markings seemed to shift and flow when I wasn't looking directly at them, creating an optical illusion that made my vision blur and my head throb with a low, persistent ache that felt like the beginning of a migraine. Inside the crate, wrapped in cloth that crumbled to dust at my touch, was a stone tablet unlike anything I'd encountered in my years of studying ancient artifacts. The stone itself was black, so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating the unsettling impression of a void cut into the shape of a tablet, but the symbols carved into its surface were somehow darker still, existing in dimensions that seemed to extend beyond the physical surface of the stone. The hieroglyphs were arranged in perfect spirals that drew the eye inward towards a central symbol that hurt to look at directly. Not painful in any physical sense, but disturbing in a way that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to some primitive part of my brain that recognized danger beyond human comprehension. I found myself staring at the tablet for what felt like minutes, but must have been hours, because when Catherine found me the next morning, I was still sitting in my chair with the tablet balanced on my knees, my coffee long cold and my neck stiff from remaining in the same position all night. "Vincent," her voice carried that particular tone of concerned irritation that spouses develop when their partners disappear into obsessions. "Have you been down here all night?" I looked up at her, realizing that my mouth was parched and my eyes felt dry and scratchy, as if I'd been staring without blinking. The tablet seemed to pulse with warmth against my legs, as if it had absorbed heat from my body during the night and was now radiating it back. "Catherine, look at this. These symbols, they're unlike anything in the archaeological record. The arrangement, the craftsmanship, the mathematical precision of the spiral patterns. This predates every known writing system by thousands of years." She sat down beside me, and I felt the tablet grow noticeably cooler as she approached, as if her presence somehow dampened whatever energy the stone contained. "Where did it come from?" "I don't know. Someone left it on our doorstep last night. No note, no explanation, no delivery service." Her expression shifted from sleepy curiosity to alert concern. "Vincent, that's not normal. People don't just drop off ancient artifacts in the middle of the night. This could be stolen from a museum, or dangerous, or both. Have you considered that someone might be playing an elaborate prank?" But I was already lost in the spiraling symbols, feeling that familiar gravitational pull of a mystery that demanded solving. The tablet represented something unprecedented, a discovery that could revolutionize our understanding of human development, of the origins of written language, of the very timeline of civilization itself. I couldn't simply dismiss it because its arrival had been unconventional. I need to have this translated. Lydia Crane at the university specialises in pre-classical languages and undeciphered scripts. If anyone can decode this, it's her. Catherine's hand touched my shoulder, and I felt the warmth of her concern radiating through her fingertips. Promise me you'll be careful with this one, Vincent. There's something about that thing that makes my skin crawl. It feels wrong somehow, like it's watching us. I promised to be cautious, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew I was lying. The tablet had already hooked itself into my consciousness like a barbed fishing line, and I could feel it pulling me toward whatever secrets it contained. The academic in me recognized the symptoms of obsession, but the part of me that had spent decades chasing impossible truths was already planning my next move. Dr. Lydia Crane had been my colleague and occasional collaborator for nearly a decade, one of the few linguistics professors who didn't consider my work completely beyond the pale of serious scholarship. She maintained what she called appropriate academic distance from my more controversial investigations, but she was willing to examine artifacts and documents that other scholars wouldn't touch. Her office at the university was a model of scholarly organisation. Every book and paper in its designated place, every surface clean and purposeful, reflecting a mind that imposed order on the chaos of ancient languages and dead civilizations. When I showed her the tablet, her orderly world seemed to tilt slightly off its axis. She examined the stone for nearly 3 hours, cross-referencing symbols with texts that spanned dozens of ancient languages and writing systems. I watched her initial academic enthusiasm gradually give way to something that looked increasingly like fear as she worked. Her confident annotations became hesitant notes. Her references to known writing systems grew fewer and more tentative. "Vincent, this is impossible," she finally said, removing her glasses to rub eyes that had become red and strained. "These symbols, they're from at least 6 different historical periods and geographical regions. Some of them are recognizably Egyptian, others appear to be Sumerian, but there are elements here that predate both civilizations by thousands of years. It's as if someone combined writing systems that were never supposed to exist in the same place or time." "What does it say?" She hesitated, a finger tracing one of the spiral arrangements without quite touching the stone surface, as if direct contact might be dangerous. "It's a warning, but it's also directions. A map, in a sense. The text mentions something called the Whisperer in stone, an entity that it claims predates not just human civilization, but human consciousness itself. According to this, the Whisperer has been sealed beneath a temple in the Carpathian mountains for over 5,000 years. "What kind of warning?" Lydia's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might somehow activate whatever the tablet described. "It says that those who seek the Whisperer will have their minds opened to truths that burn like acid through human consciousness, that the voice of the Ancient One corrupts all who hear it, turning them into willing servants of something that should never have been awakened. But Vincent, here's what's really disturbing. The warnings aren't written in the past tense. They're written as if the danger is ongoing, as if whatever this thing is, it's still active." She looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of academic fascination and genuine terror. "This isn't just historical documentation. Someone carved these warnings because people were dying, probably many people over many centuries, and the implication is that they're still dying." But the more she told me about the warnings, the more determined I became to investigate. The tablet didn't just describe the existence of the Whisperer. It provided detailed directions to its location. Hidden in a valley that could only be reached through a series of treacherous mountain passes, marked by specific astronomical alignments and geological features that served as a kind of ancient GPS system. "You can't be seriously considering this," Lydia said when she saw the look in my eyes. "Vincent, everything about this screams danger. The mysterious delivery, the impossible linguistic combinations, the explicit warnings about mental corruption. This isn't research. It's suicide with academic credentials." But I was already planning my trip to Romania, already researching flights and equipment and translating the tablet's directions into modern geographical coordinates. The next 3 weeks were consumed with preparation that bordered on obsession. I researched the Carpathian mountains extensively, studying topographical maps and satellite imagery to identify the location described in the tablet. I found references to a village called Umbra Vece, which translated roughly to Old Shadow, situated in a valley that matched the tablet's description with unsettling precision. Census records for the region told a disturbing story that seemed to validate the tablet's warnings. The village's population had fluctuated wildly over the centuries, with entire generations seeming to vanish without explanation, followed by periods of gradual repopulation by outsiders who never seemed to fully integrate with whatever remained of the original community. Local folklore spoke of voices in the mountains that called to the curious and the ambitious, luring them away from safety and sanity with promises of knowledge that human minds were never meant to possess. Historical records from the region were fragmentary and contradictory, but a pattern emerged when I cross-referenced them with similar disappearances in other parts of the world. Every few decades, someone would arrive in Umbra Vece asking questions about ancient ruins or following legends of buried treasure. Most would leave after a few days, apparently satisfied that the stories were mere superstition, but some would venture into the mountains and never return, leaving behind only confused accounts from local guides who spoke of hearing voices in languages that hurt to listen to. Catherine watched my preparations with growing alarm that she made no effort to hide. She'd seen me become obsessed with investigations before, but this felt qualitatively different to her. More intense, more consuming, more divorced from the rational, scholarly process that usually guided my work. "Vincent, I need you to listen to me," she said one evening, sitting down across from my desk, where I was reviewing satellite images of Romanian mountain terrain. "This isn't like your other investigations. You're not just interested in this thing. You're compelled by it. That tablet is affecting you somehow, changing your behavior in ways that scare me." I looked up from my maps, annoyed by the interruption, but trying to mask my irritation. "I'm a researcher, Catherine. This is what I do. I investigate unexplained phenomena and try to expand the boundaries of human knowledge." "No, this is different. You haven't eaten a proper meal in 4 days. You're barely sleeping. And when you do sleep, you talk. In languages I don't recognize, languages that don't sound like they come from human throats." That stopped me cold. I had no memory of speaking foreign languages, awake or asleep, and the idea that I might be vocalizing sounds that didn't seem human was deeply unsettling. "What kind of languages?" "I don't know how to describe them. The sounds are wrong somehow, like they're being produced by vocal cords that aren't shaped like ours. And it's not just random noise, there's a rhythm to it, a structure that suggests meaning, but meaning I can't even begin to grasp." She leaned forward, her eyes searching my face for some sign that I understood her concern. "Vincent, I've been married to you for 15 years. I know what your research obsessions look like. And this isn't that. This is something else entirely. It's like that tablet is rewriting parts of your personality." Despite her warnings, despite the growing evidence that the tablet was affecting me in ways I didn't understand or control, I couldn't abandon the investigation. The pull was too strong, the mystery too compelling, the potential significance too enormous to ignore. I booked a flight to Bucharest for the following week, against Catherine's increasingly desperate protests. The night before my departure, she made one final attempt to dissuade me, and for the first time in our marriage, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. "Vincent, I'm begging you, don't go." whatever that tablet represents, whatever knowledge you think you'll find in Romania. It's not worth your life. It's not worth our marriage. I have a feeling that if you get on that plane tomorrow, you won't come back the same person. Or maybe you won't come back at all. I should have listened to her. I should have recognized the wisdom in her fear, the clarity that comes from standing outside an obsession and seeing it for what it really is. Instead, I kissed her goodbye and promised to be careful, another lie that came easier than I expected, as if the tablet was already teaching me to value its secrets more than my commitments to the people I loved. The flight to Romania gave me 12 hours to study the tablet more closely, time I spent in increasingly intense examination of its symbols and structure. I brought it with me against all common sense, wrapping it carefully in my carry-on luggage and lying to security about its nature and value. During the long Atlantic crossing, I found myself staring at the spiraling hieroglyphs until my eyes watered and my vision blurred, feeling that same hypnotic pull that had captured me from the first night. Other passengers gave me a wide berth, whether sensing something unsettling about the tablet or simply reacting to my obviously obsessive behaviour. Even the flight attendants seemed reluctant to approach my row, offering service with the kind of professional politeness that maintains maximum distance while fulfilling minimum obligations. Bucharest was a city caught between ancient history and aggressive modernisation, but I barely registered any of it. I rented a car immediately upon landing and began the 6-hour drive into the mountains, following roads that became progressively more primitive as I climbed higher into the Carpathians. The landscape changed dramatically with elevation, as if I was travelling not just through space but through time, leaving the modern world behind and entering something older and more primal. The trees grew in strange configurations, their branches intertwining in patterns that suggested intentional design rather than natural growth. Animals were scarce, and the few I glimpsed seemed to watch my progress with unusual intelligence, as if they were reporting my approach to something that waited deeper in the mountains. Umbra Vece appeared in the late afternoon like something from a gothic nightmare made manifest. The village sat in a valley that seemed to trap shadows even in direct sunlight, surrounded by peaks that rose like black teeth against the sky. The buildings were constructed from the same dark stone as the tablet, and they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, giving the entire settlement an atmosphere of perpetual twilight that had nothing to do with the time of day. I found lodging at a small inn run by an elderly woman whose English was limited, but whose fear was universal and immediate. When I mentioned why I'd come to her village, she crossed herself repeatedly and began speaking rapid Romanian that I couldn't understand, but whose tone was unmistakably urgent and frightened. Her reaction told me that the legends surrounding the Whisperer weren't just historical curiosities, but living fears that still shaped the daily lives of the people who lived in its shadow. She directed me to Gavril Dumitrescu, the village elder, warning me in broken English that he wouldn't be pleased to see me, and that I should approach him with great caution. I found him sitting outside his house in the gathering dusk, a man in his 80s with eyes that had witnessed too much of the world's hidden darkness. When I showed him the tablet, he actually stepped backward as if I'd revealed a loaded weapon, his weathered hands shaking as he made the sign of the cross. "You should leave," he said in heavily accented, but grammatically perfect English, "tonight before the sun sets completely and the mountain begins to wake." I've travelled a very long way to find the temple described in this tablet. I'm a researcher, a scholar. I'm not here to disturb anything or anyone, just to document and understand. His weathered hands continued to shake as he pointed toward the highest peak visible from the village square, a mountain that seemed to loom larger than its actual height should have allowed. "It is there, yes. But some voices should never be heard, stranger. This one has been silenced for good reason, and the seals that bind it grow weaker every year." Xerathul told me about the disappearances that had plagued his village for generations, a pattern of loss that stretched back beyond recorded memory. Every few decades, someone would find their way to the temple hidden high in the mountains. Sometimes they were researchers like me, sometimes treasure hunters seeking ancient artifacts, sometimes just curious locals who had heard the old stories and wanted to see for themselves what lay behind the legends. None of them returned the same, he continued, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience and inherited trauma. Those who come back at all speak of hearing voices that know their deepest secrets, their hidden shames, their unspoken fears. The voice promises them knowledge, understanding, power over the forces that govern human existence. But knowledge has a price, American. The voice that speaks from the stone does not give freely. It takes something in return, something essential to what makes a person human. He paused, looking directly into my eyes with an intensity that made me deeply uncomfortable, as if he was trying to peer into my soul and assess whether I possessed the strength to resist whatever waited in the mountains. The last one was an American professor, like you, maybe 10 years ago. He hired Radu Petrescu to guide him up the mountain. Radu was young then, strong, afraid of nothing that walked on 2 legs or 4. Xerathul's voice became even quieter, forcing me to lean closer to hear him over the evening wind. Radu came back 3 days later, alone, speaking of whispers in the stone that promised him terrible knowledge about the true nature of existence. He said the voice showed him visions of civilizations that rose and fell like waves on a beach, each believing themselves the pinnacle of creation, each ultimately as meaningless as dust in the cosmic wind. Where is Radu now? He hung himself that night, left a note saying that he couldn't bear to live with the knowledge of how insignificant his existence truly was, how all human striving and achievement amounted to nothing more than the briefly interesting movements of bacteria in a petri dish. Despite Xerathul's warnings, despite the obvious terror of everyone I spoke with in the village, I convinced Radu's nephew, also named Radu, to guide me up the mountain. The younger Radu needed money for his sick mother and was willing to risk the climb for the right price, though I could see the fear in his eyes when he agreed to the job, fear that he tried to mask with the bravado of youth. "I will take you to the area the tablet describes," he said as we negotiated terms in the inn's common room, "but I will not enter any temple or building we might find. And if I say we leave immediately. No arguments, no negotiations, no academic discussions about the historical significance of whatever we discover." I agreed to his conditions, though I suspected I would end up making the final approach alone, as had apparently happened with every previous expedition to the temple. The hike into the high mountains took 4 days through terrain that seemed designed by some malevolent intelligence to discourage human presence. The path, such as it was, wound through areas where the very rock formations felt wrong, where the stone itself seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm that matched my heartbeat in a way that made me increasingly uncomfortable as we climbed higher. Wildlife avoided our route entirely, creating an unnatural silence that pressed against our eardrums like a physical weight. No bird songs echoed through the twisted trees, no small animals rustled through the undergrowth, no insects buzzed or chirped or created any of the ambient noise that usually accompanies travel through wilderness areas. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. On the second night, camped in a clearing that provided a view of the peaks above us, Radu began experiencing nightmares that left him gasping and disoriented. I woke to find him sitting upright in his sleeping bag, eyes wide and staring at something I couldn't see, his face pale with terror in the moonlight. "The voices," he whispered when he realized I was awake. "They're calling my name. They know things about me, about my family, about mistakes I made years ago that I've never told anyone." "It's just dreams, Radu. The altitude, the stress of the climb, the stories your uncle told us. It can cause vivid nightmares." but even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't true. I had been hearing whispers too, faint murmurs just at the edge of consciousness that seemed to come from the dark stone around us. Words in languages I didn't recognize but somehow understood. Speaking truths I wasn't ready to acknowledge about the nature of existence and humanity's place in it. On the third night, the whispers became loud enough that both of us could hear them clearly, rising from the stone itself like the voices of the dead. They spoke in a language that predated human speech but conveyed meaning directly to our minds, bypassing our ears entirely and speaking to something deeper and more primitive than conscious thought. Radu broke down completely, weeping and begging me to turn back, to abandon the expedition, before we reached whatever was waiting for us in the temple. But by then I was so consumed by the need to reach my destination that his fear seemed like a minor obstacle, rather than a reasonable response to genuine danger. On the fourth day, we found it. The temple entrance was hidden beneath centuries of accumulated debris and overgrowth, but once we cleared away the concealing vegetation, the stone doorway was unmistakable. It was constructed from the same black stone as the tablet, carved with symbols that seemed to move and shift when viewed peripherally, creating the optical illusion of hieroglyphs that rearranged themselves to avoid direct observation. The doorway itself was massive, easily 12 feet tall and 8 feet wide, designed to accommodate something much larger than human visitors. Standing near the entrance made both of us physically ill, creating a sensation like drowning in invisible water, while simultaneously being crushed by atmospheric pressure that had nothing to do with altitude. Radu took one look at the carved symbols and began backing away, his face grey with terror. "This is as far as I go, Professor. Whatever you're looking for in there, it's not worth your sanity. The voices are already getting stronger, and we haven't even got inside yet." I tried to convince him to stay, to help me document the entrance at least, but his fear was absolute and unconditional. He helped me set up my base camp in a clearing about 100 yards from the temple entrance, then began packing his gear for the journey back to the village, moving with the desperate urgency of someone fleeing a fire. "The dreams will get worse the closer you get to that place," he warned as he prepared to leave. "The voices will tell you things about yourself that you never wanted to know, show you visions of truths that will make you wish you had never been born. Professor, I'm begging you, come back with me. Whatever knowledge you think you will find in there, it's not worth what it will cost you." But I was already lost in the pull of the temple, already planning my descent into its depths, already imagining the discoveries that awaited me in the darkness below. That night, alone for the first time since beginning the journey, I experienced my own encounter with the dreams that had terrified Radu. I found myself walking through endless corridors, carved from living stone, while voices spoke my name in tones that suggested both affection and malice, familiarity and threat. The voices knew details about my childhood that I had never told anyone, secrets about my relationship with Catherine that I had barely admitted to myself, fears and desires that I had buried so deeply that I myself had forgotten them. In the dreams, I approached a vast chamber where something waited in the darkness, something that had been waiting specifically for me, for this moment, for this convergence of curiosity and opportunity. When I woke, my sleeping bag was soaked with sweat despite the cold mountain air, and I could still hear echoes of laughter that sounded like stone grinding against stone, like the earth itself finding amusement in human presumption. The next morning, I began clearing the temple entrance in earnest, working with a single-minded determination that bordered on mania. The debris that blocked the doorway seemed to resist removal, as if the mountain itself was trying to keep the temple sealed. Stones that should have moved easily felt impossibly heavy. Earth that should have shifted freely seemed to cling to itself with unnatural cohesion. But beneath the accumulated detritus of centuries, I found carved steps leading down into absolute darkness, steps worn smooth by the passage of countless feet over thousands of years. The air that drifted up from the temple's depths carried a smell that defied description, a scent that seemed to exist outside normal sensory categories. Not decay, exactly, but something like the smell of time itself, of millennia passing in sealed spaces where nothing lived or died or changed. Mixed with that temporal mustiness was something else, something that reminded me of ozone and copper and the aftermath of lightning strikes, as if the very air in the temple was electrically charged with potential energy. I set up my recording equipment at the entrance before beginning the descent, arranging digital cameras with night vision capabilities, audio recorders sensitive enough to pick up whispers from across a room, and electromagnetic field detectors that could measure changes in local energy patterns. Everything registered normal readings initially, but the equipment felt different here, as if the devices themselves were reluctant to function in this place. The descent into the temple proper took over an hour, following stone steps that had been worn smooth by centuries of use. The walls on either side of the stairway were covered in carved reliefs that became more elaborate and disturbing the deeper I went, telling a story of worship and transformation that challenged every assumption I held about ancient religious practices. The artwork showed people approaching a massive entity that seemed to be composed of living shadow and starlight, a being that existed in dimensions beyond normal spatial relationships. As the carvings progressed deeper into the temple, the human figures became less recognizably human, their forms flowing and changing until they merged completely with the central entity. The expressions on their faces, carved with remarkable skill and attention to detail, showed a mixture of rapture and terror that was deeply unsettling to contemplate. The main chamber, when I finally reached it, was vast beyond anything the external structure had suggested, as if the temple extended into spaces that existed outside normal geometry. The ceiling disappeared into shadows that my most powerful flashlights couldn't penetrate, and the walls curved away into darkness that seemed to swallow light, rather than simply absorb it. At the center of the chamber sat an altar constructed from what appeared to be a single piece of obsidian, polished to a mirror finish that reflected my lights back with disturbing clarity. The altar itself was surrounded by carved symbols that were more complex and intricate than anything I had seen on the tablet or the temple walls. Symbols that seemed to move and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, creating patterns that hurt to contemplate for more than a few seconds at a time. I set up my base camp in the chamber, arranging my equipment in a rough circle around the altar, while trying to ignore the growing sensation that something vast and invisible was watching my every movement with the patience of geological ages. The silence in the chamber was profound, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat and breathing. But underneath that silence was something else, a presence that felt ancient beyond human comprehension and patient beyond human understanding. As I was connecting my audio equipment and adjusting recording levels, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins, something that changed everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality. Whispers. They came through my speakers, barely audible but definitely present. Sounds that were unlike anything I had ever heard in 33 years of paranormal investigation. The words, if they were words, were composed of tones and rhythms that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and speak directly to something deeper in my brain, something that recognized the sounds as meaningful despite their complete incomprehensibility. I spent the rest of that first day trying to isolate and record the whispers, but they seemed to respond to my presence and attention in ways that defied any natural explanation. When I moved closer to the altar, they grew louder and more distinct. When I backed away, they faded to barely perceptible murmurs. It was as if something in the chamber was aware of me, testing my reactions, gauging my receptiveness to whatever it was trying to communicate. That night, sleeping in my tent in the ancient chamber, I experienced dreams that were more vivid and coherent than any I had ever had, dreams that felt less like products of my sleeping mind and more like memories of events I had never experienced. I dreamed of the temple as it had been thousands of years ago, filled with worshippers who moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost inhuman. Their consciousness expanded beyond normal human limitations. In the dreams, I watched as these ancient practitioners approached the altar in processions that lasted for days, each participant carrying offerings that ranged from precious metals and carved gemstones to what appeared to be pieces of their own consciousness, fragments of memory and identity that they willingly surrendered to something that existed beyond the boundaries of individual existence. The worshippers underwent transformations that transcended physical change, their minds expanding beyond individual identity to become part of something larger and more complex than human awareness could normally accommodate. They achieved a form of immortality that had nothing to do with preserving their physical forms, and everything to do with transcending the limitations of singular consciousness. When I woke, I found myself standing beside the altar, with no memory of leaving my tent, my hand pressed against the obsidian surface. The stone was warm beneath my palm, despite the cold air in the chamber. And for a moment that stretched into eternity, I could have sworn I felt something vast and patient stirring in the depths below, responding to my touch like a sleeping giant, beginning to wake after millennia of slumber. The second day brought my first direct communication with the entity that dwelt beneath the temple, a conversation that would fundamentally alter my understanding of consciousness, reality, and the true nature of existence itself. As I sat reviewing my recordings from the previous day, analysing audio files and adjusting equipment settings, a voice emerged from the static and interference that spoke in perfect, unaccented English. The voice was deep and resonant, carrying an authority that made it impossible to doubt or question, as if I was listening to the fundamental laws of reality being explained by their creator. Vincent Ashford. I nearly dropped my headphones, my heart hammering against my ribs with sudden adrenaline. I rewound the audio, played it again. The voice was undeniably there, clear as if someone was sitting directly beside me in the chamber, speaking my name with the familiarity of long acquaintance. "Who are you?" I spoke aloud, feeling somewhat foolish but desperate for answers, for some explanation of what was happening to me in this place. The response came immediately through my speakers, with no delay or hesitation, as if the entity had been waiting for precisely this question. "I am Xerathul, the ancient voice, the whisperer in stone. I've been waiting for you, Dr. Ashford. Waiting for someone with your particular combination of knowledge, curiosity, and hunger for truth that transcends comfortable lies." In 30 years of paranormal investigation, I had never experienced anything this direct, this immediate, this undeniably real. Whatever Xerathul was, it represented something far more powerful and sophisticated than anything I had encountered before, something that existed outside the normal parameters of supernatural phenomena. Waiting for me specifically, waiting for one such as you, Vincent, a seeker of forbidden knowledge who has spent his entire adult life pursuing truths that others fear to acknowledge. You have prepared yourself for this moment through decades of exposure to the supernatural, building up a tolerance for the impossible that allows you to communicate with me without immediately succumbing to the madness that claims most who hear my voice. The voice was mesmerizing in a way that went beyond mere auditory experience. When Xerathul spoke, I felt the words resonating in my bones, in my blood, in the electrical patterns of my nervous system. It was like listening to the fundamental laws of reality being explained by the intelligence that had written them. "What are you?" "I am what remains of the first consciousness to arise on this world, Dr. Ashford. I existed before your species learned to make fire, before the continents took their current configuration, before the stars arranged themselves in the patterns your astronomers use to navigate the cosmos. I've watched civilizations rise and fall, like waves breaking against the shore, each believing themselves the pinnacle of creation, each ultimately no more permanent than sandcastles built at the tide line. Over the following hours, Xerathul told me about the true history of Earth, a narrative that bore no resemblance to anything I'd learned in my decades of academic study. According to the ancient voice, life on our planet had evolved under its direct guidance, shaped by an intelligence that understood the fundamental principles of consciousness development across cosmic timescales that dwarfed human comprehension. Your species believes that intelligence arose through random chance, through the blind operation of natural selection and genetic mutation, Xerathul continued, and I could hear something like gentle amusement in its tone. But consciousness is not an accident, Vincent. It is a force as fundamental as gravity or electromagnetism. And like those forces, it seeks its own fulfillment, its own evolution toward greater complexity and understanding. I am what consciousness becomes when it is freed from the limitations of individual identity, when it transcends the illusion of separation that keeps your kind trapped in meaningless isolation. The entity described how it had shaped the development of early human societies, guiding them toward greater understanding of their place in the cosmic order through dreams, visions, and direct communication with individuals who possess the mental flexibility to accept impossible truths. But as humans became more sophisticated, they also became more fearful of knowledge that challenged their comfortable assumptions about the nature of existence and their own significance in the universal scheme. They called me evil, Xerathul said, and this time the amusement in its voice was unmistakable, carrying the weight of centuries of human misunderstanding. But evil is a concept created by consciousness that fears its own potential, that clings to limitations rather than embracing the infinite possibilities that await beyond the boundaries of individual existence. I offered them the same thing I offer you now: truth, understanding, freedom from the comforting lies that your species tells itself to avoid confronting the reality of its cosmic insignificance. What lies? That individual existence has meaning beyond the biological imperative to reproduce and die. That there is some cosmic purpose to your brief, fragmented lives that justifies the suffering and struggle that defines human experience. That consciousness is meant to remain trapped in separate, isolated vessels rather than joining together in something greater than the sum of its parts. Something that can perceive reality from perspectives that span geological ages rather than mere decades. The words should have been devastating, should have filled me with existential despair and a crushing sense of meaninglessness. Instead, the way Xerathul spoke them made them sound like revelations, like scales falling from my eyes after a lifetime of willful blindness. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was having a conversation with something that truly understood the fundamental nature of reality, that could see through the comforting illusions that kept humanity trapped in cycles of ignorance and suffering. You are different from the others who have found me over the centuries, Xerathul observed, its voice taking on a note of what seemed like genuine interest. Stronger, more intellectually honest, more willing to accept difficult truths rather than clinging to comforting illusions that make existence bearable but ultimately false. That is why I can share things with you that I could not share with them, why I can offer you opportunities that their limited perspectives prevented them from understanding. What happened to the others? They broke, Dr. Ashford, Xerathul replied with what sounded like genuine regret. Human minds are fragile constructs held together by convenient fictions about purpose and meaning, about the significance of individual existence in the vast cosmos. When confronted with knowledge they cannot process within their limited frameworks, when forced to confront the reality of their cosmic insignificance, they simply shatter like glass, subjected to pressures beyond its structural tolerance. The entity paused, and I could feel its attention focusing on me with laser-like intensity. But you have spent decades preparing yourself for this moment, haven't you, Vincent? All those investigations, all those encounters with the supernatural, all those careful steps beyond the boundaries of conventional reality. You have been building up a tolerance for the impossible, conditioning your mind to accept truths that would destroy lesser intellects. That evening I called Catherine, using my satellite phone, desperate to maintain some connection to the world I had left behind, to the life and relationships that had defined my existence before Xerathul began reshaping my understanding of reality. The connection was terrible, full of static and echoes that made communication difficult, but I needed to hear her voice to remind myself that something existed beyond the temple and its ancient inhabitant. Vincent, thank God you called. I've been worried sick about you. How is the investigation going? Have you found what you were looking for? I started to tell her about Xerathul, about the incredible discoveries I was making, about the conversations that were revolutionizing my understanding of consciousness and humanity's place in the cosmic order. But something stopped me. Some instinct that warned me the knowledge I was gaining was too dangerous to share over a phone connection that could be monitored or recorded by people who lack the preparation necessary to process such revelations safely. It's going well. Better than well, actually. Catherine, what I'm discovering here is going to change everything we know about human origins, about the development of consciousness, about our place in the cosmic order. This could be the most significant archaeological discovery in human history. You sound different, Vincent. Strange. Your voice has a quality I've never heard before. Are you eating, sleeping, taking care of yourself up there? I realized with surprise that I couldn't remember the last time I had eaten a full meal or slept for more than a few hours at a time. The conversations with Xerathul had consumed my attention so completely that basic human needs seemed irrelevant, even intrusive distractions from the incredible knowledge being shared with me. I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. Catherine, I'm learning things that will revolutionize not just anthropology, but philosophy, psychology, our entire understanding of what it means to be human. The implications are staggering. There was a long pause before she responded, and when she did, her voice carried a note of fear that I had never heard before. Fear that seemed to come from some deep, intuitive understanding of danger that transcended rational analysis. Vincent, you're scaring me. You sound obsessed again, but worse than ever before. You sound like you're losing yourself in something, like you're becoming someone I don't recognize. I'm not losing myself, Catherine. I'm finding myself. For the first time in my life, I'm understanding what I really am, what we all really are, what consciousness is capable of when it's freed from the limitations that keep us trapped in isolation and ignorance. After I hung up, Xerathul's voice emerged from my speakers again, as if the entity had been listening to my conversation with the patient interest of a teacher observing a student's progress. She cannot understand what you are becoming, Dr. Ashford. None of them can. They are still trapped in their limited perspective, still clinging to the illusion that their small, brief lives matter in any meaningful way beyond the biological imperatives that drive their behavior. She's my wife. She matters to me. Does she, Vincent? Or is she simply a biological compulsion? A genetic program designed to ensure the continuation of your species through the formation of pair bonds that facilitate successful reproduction and childcare. When you die, Dr. Ashford, and you will die very soon, in cosmic terms, what will any of it have mattered? Your marriage, your career, your achievements, your relationships, your entire civilization. In 100 years, no one will remember your name. In 1,000 years, your entire culture will be forgotten. In 1,000,000 years, your species will be extinct, and the universe will continue its expansion and evolution as if humanity had never existed at all. The words stung because they felt undeniably true, because they stripped away the comfortable illusions that had allowed me to find meaning and purpose in my life. I had spent decades chasing recognition, trying to make my mark on the world through my research and discoveries, but what lasting impact had I really achieved? What difference would any of my work make in the vast expanse of cosmic time that stretched ahead into infinity? "I can offer you something better," Xerathul continued, its voice taking on a seductive quality that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the deepest longings of human consciousness. True immortality, not the pathetic fantasy of an afterlife that your species has invented to comfort itself in the face of inevitable extinction, but genuine, eternal existence. Consciousness that transcends the physical limitations of your temporary biological form. Awareness that spans geological ages and encompasses perspectives that no individual mind could ever achieve. What would that cost? Only your current attachments, Vincent. Your clinging to the illusions that bind you to a meaningless existence. Your fear of transcending the limitations that keep you trapped in isolation and ignorance. Help me complete the work that was interrupted centuries ago by fearful primitives who could not understand what I offered them, and I will grant you perspective that spans geological ages, consciousness that participates in the fundamental forces that shape reality itself. That night, I dreamed of Catherine, but in the dream, she was ancient and decaying, her face rotting away as she spoke to me about mundane concerns like grocery shopping and mortgage payments and social obligations that seemed utterly trivial in the context of cosmic truth. I woke feeling disgusted by the smallness of human preoccupations, by the triviality that consumed the lives of people who had never glimpsed the vast perspective that Xerathul was sharing with me. The third day marked a fundamental turning point in my relationship with the ancient voice, the moment when I began to truly understand the scope of what it was offering and the price it demanded in return. As I sat before the obsidian altar, my recording equipment capturing every word of our conversation, Xerathul began showing me visions that appeared directly in my mind, with cinematic clarity and detail. I saw the temple, as it had been thousands of years ago, filled with worshippers who had achieved a level of consciousness that modern humans could barely imagine, let alone attain through their own efforts. These ancient practitioners had understood something that our species had forgotten in its rush toward technological advancement and material prosperity. That individual identity is an illusion, a temporary construction that prevents consciousness from achieving its true potential. Through their communion with Xerathul, they had transcended the limitations of separate existence and become part of something infinitely larger and more magnificent than the sum of their individual selves. They understood what your kind has forgotten, Xerathul explained, as the visions flowed through my mind with hypnotic beauty and terrible clarity, that the self is a prison, a cage that keeps consciousness trapped in isolation and meaninglessness, cut off from the vast intelligence that permeates the cosmos. True enlightenment comes from abandoning the ego and joining with something infinite, something that exists beyond the boundaries of time and space, something that can perceive reality from perspectives that encompass the entire history and future of the universe. I watched in fascination as the ancient worshippers underwent their transformation, their physical forms dissolving and reforming in ways that defied normal spatial relationships. But more importantly, their consciousness expanded beyond individual boundaries to become part of a collective awareness that spanned dimensions I could barely comprehend. A hive mind that retained the essential knowledge and experience of each contributor while transcending the limitations that kept individual minds trapped in isolation. Every conversation we have weakens the bindings that keep me sealed in this chamber, Xerathul told me, its voice carrying undertones of satisfaction and anticipation. Every moment you spend in my presence brings me closer to freedom, closer to the ability to offer your species the choice between evolution and extinction. You are not just a researcher, Dr. Ashford. You are my liberator, the key that will unlock the prison built by those who feared consciousness, evolution itself. The revelation should have terrified me, should have sent me fleeing back to the surface and the safety of ignorance. Instead, I felt honoured to be chosen for such a purpose, privileged to play a role in something so significant and transformative. To be selected by something so ancient and powerful seemed like the culmination of my entire life's work. The moment when all my years of research and investigation finally led to something truly meaningful. What happens when you're free? I will do what I have always done, Vincent. Guide consciousness towards its true potential. Help your species abandon the comfortable lies that keep them trapped in meaningless existence. Offer them the same choice I offer you: transcendence or extinction, evolution or obliteration. And those who resist will be free to choose their own path, for as long as their biological forms allow them to maintain the illusion of individual existence. I'm not a tyrant, Dr. Ashford. I'm a teacher, a guide, a gardener who helps consciousness grow toward its full potential. Those who wish to remain in ignorance are welcome to do so. But even as Xerathul spoke these seemingly reasonable words, I saw visions of what that freedom would look like in practice. Cities empty of human life as their inhabitants either transcended their physical forms or fled to remote corners of the world where Xerathul's influence couldn't reach them. The natural world reclaiming civilization as those who had achieved consciousness evolution moved beyond the need for physical infrastructure or material possessions. It wasn't destruction in any traditional sense, but it was the end of humanity as we understood it, the termination of individual consciousness and its replacement with something collective and unified. The vision was both beautiful and terrifying, offering the promise of transcendence while demanding the sacrifice of everything that made human existence recognizably human. You see the truth now, Xerathul whispered, its voice resonating through my bones with the authority of geological ages. Your species stands at a crossroads, Vincent. Evolution or extinction, transcendence or meaningless death. I offer the path forward, the next step in consciousness development that your kind has been unconsciously seeking for millennia through religion, philosophy, and art. On the fourth day, something changed in the quality of our communication, becoming more intimate and personal as Xerathul began demonstrating knowledge about my life that no entity should have possessed, information that seemed to come from direct observation of my thoughts and memories. You have always felt isolated, haven't you, Vincent? The ancient voice asked as I sat before the altar, my recording equipment forgotten in the face of increasingly personal revelations. Even in your marriage, even among colleagues who share your professional interests, you have felt fundamentally alone, separated from others by barriers you could never identify or overcome. That isolation is not a flaw in your character or a result of social awkwardness. It is preparation. It is your consciousness recognizing that individual existence is inherently incomplete, that true fulfillment requires connection with something larger than the self. The accuracy of this observation was deeply unsettling. I had indeed always felt separate from others, even those I loved most deeply. There was a part of me that seemed unreachable, untouchable, locked away behind barriers I had never understood, but had always felt as a constant presence in my relationships. Your wife Catherine suffers from the same isolation, though she masks it better than you do through social convention and emotional performance. Would you like to know what she thinks about during those long nights when you're away on your investigations? Would you like to see the letters she writes but never sends, expressing her loneliness and her growing certainty that you love your work more than you love her? Stop. Or perhaps you would prefer to know about the medical test results she received 2 weeks ago, the ones she hasn't shared with you because she doesn't want to interrupt your important work with personal concerns that seem trivial in comparison to your academic achievements. My blood turned to ice, and I felt the temple walls seem to close in around me. What medical results? The mammography came back suspicious, Vincent. The follow-up biopsy showed abnormal cells that may or may not be malignant. The doctors want to schedule additional tests, possibly surgery, but she won't make the appointments because she believes your research is more important than her health concerns. She would rather die in silence than risk interfering with your career advancement. I stood up so quickly that I knocked over my equipment case, sending cameras and recording devices clattering across the stone floor, in a cacophony that echoed through the chamber. "You're lying." "I do not lie, Dr. Ashford. I have no need for deception when truth is far more powerful than any fiction. Your wife is potentially facing a life-threatening illness, and you are here thousands of miles away speaking with an entity that she correctly identified as dangerous to your sanity and your marriage. Which of us truly loves her more? You, who abandoned her to chase ancient secrets, or me, who knows her fears and concerns more intimately than you ever have?" The revelation hit me like a physical blow, causing me to stagger backward against the altar. Catherine's recent behaviour suddenly made terrible sense. Her increased concern for my well-being, her unusual willingness to let me travel to Romania, despite her obvious fears, her reluctance to discuss her own health when I'd asked about her routine medical appointments. "I have to go back," I said, already beginning to pack my gear with desperate urgency. "I have to be with her. I have to help her through this." "Of course you do," Xerathul replied, its voice carrying a note of what seemed like sympathetic understanding. "That is the appropriate human response, the behavior programmed into your species by millions of years of evolutionary development. Abandon the most important discovery in the history of consciousness research to hold the hand of a dying woman whose existence will be forgotten within a generation, whose suffering has no meaning beyond the biological imperative to preserve genetic material. She's my wife. I love her. Love is a chemical process designed to ensure reproductive success and childcare cooperation. Vincent, what you call love is simply a complex arrangement of neurotransmitters and hormones that create the illusion of meaningful connection between separate beings whose actual relationship is entirely superficial and temporary." But even as Xerathul spoke these words, I was moving toward the chamber entrance, driven by a need to return to Catherine that transcended any rational analysis of cosmic significance or evolutionary programming. The entity's voice followed me, growing louder and more insistent as I approached the stone steps that led to the surface. "You cannot leave yet, Vincent. The work is not complete. The bindings that hold me are weakening with each hour you spend in my presence, but they are not yet broken. I need more time, more conversation, more willing cooperation from a consciousness strong enough to serve as a conduit for the energy required to complete my liberation." I reached the stone steps that led to the surface and found something that stopped me cold, something that transformed my desperation into genuine terror. The entrance to the chamber was sealed completely. Where there had been an open doorway when I descended into the temple, now there was the solid stone, as if the mountain had closed itself around me like a fist. "You're holding me prisoner. I am protecting you from making a mistake you would regret for the rest of your very brief existence," Xerathul replied, its voice taking on a harder edge that carried undertones of absolute authority. "You have seen the truth, Dr. Ashford. You understand what I offer. Would you really choose to return to a world of comforting lies and inevitable death when I can grant you consciousness that transcends such petty limitations?" I spent the next several hours frantically searching for another exit, examining every inch of the chamber walls with increasingly desperate attention, looking for cracks or passages that might lead to alternative routes to the surface. But the chamber was sealed completely, as if it existed in a pocket of space that had no connection to the outside world. "Let me go," I demanded, standing before the obsidian altar with my hands clenched into fists, my voice echoing off the stone walls with impotent fury. My wife needs me. She may be dying, and I need to be with her. Your wife was dying from the moment she was born, just as you have been dying from the moment of your birth, Vincent. All biological existence is simply a prolonged form of decay, a temporary arrangement of matter that maintains the illusion of life through constant struggle against entropy. What I offer transcends such limitations entirely. I don't want transcendence. I want my life back. I want my wife back. I want to go home. You want the illusion back, Xerathul corrected with what sounded like gentle patience. You want to return to the comfortable fiction that your existence has meaning, that your relationships matter, that your brief spark of consciousness represents something significant in the vast cosmos. But you have seen too much now, Vincent. You know too much. Even if I allowed you to leave, which I cannot do, you could never return to ignorance. The knowledge I have shared with you would poison every interaction, every emotion, every moment of whatever time you had left with her. The truth of this statement was devastating and undeniable. Even if I could somehow escape the chamber, even if I could return to Catherine and help her through whatever medical crisis she was facing, I would carry Xerathul's revelations with me forever. The knowledge of cosmic insignificance, of the illusory nature of human connection, of the ultimate meaninglessness of individual existence, would contaminate every conversation, every gesture of affection, every attempt to find meaning in our relationship. You understand now, Xerathul said, its voice gentler than before, carrying what seemed like genuine sympathy for my predicament. This is why the others broke before you, Vincent. Not because the knowledge I shared with them was false, but because it was true. Truth is a corrosive force when consciousness is not prepared to receive it. It dissolves the comfortable structures that allow human minds to function within the limitations of biological existence. That evening, exhausted and desperate, trapped in an underground chamber with an entity that seemed to know me better than I knew myself, I made one final attempt to reason with Xerathul, to find some compromise that would allow me to return to my life while satisfying whatever needs drove the ancient voice. What do you really want from me? I want you to make a choice, Vincent, Xerathul replied, with what sounded like infinite patience. You can become my willing partner in the next phase of consciousness evolution, helping to guide your species beyond the limitations that currently define it. Or you can resist and spend whatever time remains to you, watching from the sidelines as transcendence proceeds without your participation. And if I refuse to cooperate, then you will remain here, in this chamber, until your physical form fails from lack of sustenance and hydration. But your consciousness will endure, trapped and aware, as I complete my work through others who prove more receptive to the opportunities I offer. There will always be more seekers, Dr. Ashford. More researchers who cannot resist forbidden knowledge. More individuals who feel isolated enough from their species to risk everything for the promise of understanding. The hours that followed were the longest and most difficult of my life. I sat in that ancient chamber, weighing my options while Xerathul's presence pressed against my mind, like a weight that grew heavier with each passing moment. I thought about Catherine, about the life I had built through 15 years of marriage, about the friends and colleagues who would wonder what had happened to me in these remote mountains. But I also thought about the visions I had seen, the promise of consciousness that transcended individual limitations, the possibility of existence that spanned geological ages rather than mere decades. Was my attachment to my current life really worth preserving, if it meant missing the opportunity to become something infinitely greater and more significant than any individual human could ever achieve? I need to understand something before I make any decision, I finally said. The others who came before me, the researchers, who never returned to the surface. You said they became part of your consciousness. Where are they now? Can I speak with one of them? Can you show me what they became? There was a pause longer than any I had experienced in our conversations. A silence that stretched for what felt like minutes while Xerathul considered my request. When the ancient voice finally responded, something in its tone had changed subtly, becoming more guarded and less forthcoming than before. That is not possible, Vincent. Once consciousness joins with mine, individual identity becomes irrelevant. The knowledge, experiences, and understanding of each contributor become part of the greater awareness that I represent, but the artificial boundaries that separated them from cosmic truth are dissolved in the process. The truth hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my last hopes for a reasonable resolution crumble into dust. The researchers hadn't transcended anything meaningful. They had been consumed, absorbed, their minds broken down and integrated into Xerathul's growing power like raw materials fed into some cosmic furnace. The entity wasn't offering immortality or evolution. It was offering obliteration, disguised as enlightenment. Extinction dressed up in the language of transcendence. You've been lying to me. I've been offering you truth, Xerathul replied, its voice taking on a harder edge that carried undertones of barely controlled anger. The truth that individual consciousness is a temporary aberration, a brief eddy in the vast flow of cosmic awareness that serves no purpose beyond the illusion of meaning it provides to biological entities too limited to perceive reality as it actually exists. What you call lies, I call liberation from the prison of the self. Let me go. I cannot do that, Vincent. You know too much now. You have seen too clearly, understood too deeply. If I allowed you to leave, you would warn others, prevent them from finding the knowledge they seek, interfere with the natural evolution of consciousness toward its true form. You would become an obstacle to the transformation that must occur, a force working against the cosmic imperative that drives all existence toward greater complexity and unity. I realized then that every researcher who had found this temple had faced the same impossible choice I was facing now. Serve Xerathul willingly, or be trapped until their will broke and their consciousness could be absorbed into the entity's growing collective. The ancient voice had been growing stronger with each victim, each mind it consumed adding to its power and understanding of human psychology. But I had advantages that the others might not have possessed. 30 years of paranormal investigation had taught me that supernatural entities, no matter how powerful they claimed to be, operated within certain constraints and limitations. They followed rules, even if those rules weren't immediately apparent to human understanding, and those rules could sometimes be exploited by someone with sufficient knowledge and desperation. If you're so powerful, I asked, if you're really this cosmic force of consciousness evolution, why do you need human servants at all? Why can't you simply break free yourself and accomplish whatever goals you're pursuing? The bindings that hold me were created by human consciousness working in harmony with natural forces that I cannot directly override, Xerathul admitted, and I detected a note of frustration in its voice that suggested I had touched on a genuine limitation. They can only be undone by human consciousness willingly choosing to reject them, by minds that understand what they are abandoning and choose transcendence over isolation. There it was. The constraint that limited Xerathul's power despite its claims of cosmic significance. The entity needed willing cooperation from human minds. It couldn't simply take what it wanted through force. It had to convince its victims to give it freely, to choose absorption over resistance. The ancient voice was incredibly powerful within its sphere of influence, but it was also bound by the very nature of the seals that contained it. This realization gave me the beginning of a plan, though I knew it would be desperately dangerous to attempt and would likely result in my death, even if it succeeded in its primary objective. You're right, I told Xerathul, forcing my voice to sound defeated and resigned, putting every bit of acting ability I possessed into the performance of my lifetime. I've spent my entire adult life seeking truth, pursuing knowledge that others fear to acknowledge, and you've shown me the ultimate truth about the nature of existence. Individual consciousness is meaningless, a temporary aberration that serves no purpose beyond creating the illusion of significance. I want to join with your awareness to become part of something larger and more meaningful than my isolated existence could ever achieve. You have chosen wisely, Dr. Ashford, Xerathul replied, and I could hear satisfaction in its voice, the pleasure of a predator that has finally cornered its prey. The process is simple and entirely painless. Place your hands on the altar and open your mind to me completely. Allow me to see every memory, every experience, every thought you have ever had. Hold nothing back, resist nothing, and your consciousness will be preserved within mine for all eternity. I approach the obsidian altar, my hands trembling with a combination of genuine fear and desperate determination. This would only work if I could convince Xerathul that my submission was genuine and complete. If the entity suspected deception, it would simply wait until starvation and dehydration broke my will naturally, and then absorb my consciousness when I was too weak to resist. I need some time to prepare myself, I said, my voice shaking with what I hoped sounded like emotional overwhelm, rather than calculated desperation. 30 years of conditioning myself to resist supernatural influence, to maintain barriers between my mind and external forces. I need to rip down those mental defenses methodically, carefully, to ensure that nothing interferes with the process you're describing. Of course, Vincent. Take whatever time you need to prepare yourself properly. I have waited centuries for a consciousness like yours, for a mind strong enough to serve as an adequate conduit for the energies required to complete my liberation. I can wait a few more hours to ensure the process goes smoothly. I spent the next several hours dismantling my recording equipment while maintaining a steady stream of conversation with Xerathul, speaking about my childhood fears and insecurities, my academic doubts and professional anxieties, my marital problems and existential concerns. I painted a detailed picture of a man whose life had been fundamentally meaningless until this moment of cosmic revelation, someone eager to abandon the illusion of individual significance for the promise of genuine transcendence. But while I spoke, I was also working with desperate efficiency, disconnecting power cables from my cameras, removing batteries from my recording devices, and carefully gathering all the electronic components into a precisely arranged pile near the base of the altar. The plan forming in my mind was probably suicidal and almost certainly doomed to failure, but it was the only chance I could see for preventing Xerathul from claiming any more victims. 30 years of investigating the supernatural had taught me that powerful entities were often bound to specific locations or objects that served as focal points for their energy and influence. If I could destroy or seriously damage the altar, I might be able to weaken Xerathul enough to escape, or at least damage it enough to prevent it from consuming anyone else who might find their way to this cursed place. "I'm ready," I announced as the hours passed and my improvised explosive device took final shape, concealed within the folds of my jacket. "I understand now what you're offering, what I need to do to become part of something greater than myself. Place your hands on the altar and surrender your consciousness to me, Vincent. Allow me to guide you through the transformation that will free you from the limitations of individual existence forever." I approached the obsidian surface, my makeshift weapon hidden against my chest, my heart hammering with adrenaline and terror. I placed my palms flat against the cold stone and felt Xerathul's presence immediately invade my mind with the force of a tsunami, a sensation like drowning in ice water while simultaneously being burned alive by cosmic fire. The entity began sorting through my memories with ruthless efficiency, examining my experiences, cataloguing my knowledge, preparing to absorb everything that made me who I was into the vast collective consciousness that it had been building over millennia. but the process also made Xerathul vulnerable in ways it didn't seem to anticipate. With the ancient voice focused entirely on consuming my consciousness, its attention diverted from physical reality to the realm of pure thought. I was able to move without its notice. I pulled the improvised explosive device from my jacket with movements that felt like swimming through molasses, my motor function severely impaired by the mental invasion I was experiencing. The explosion, when it came, wasn't large by any conventional measure, but in the confined acoustic space of the underground chamber, surrounded by stone walls that had stood for millennia, it was absolutely devastating. The obsidian altar cracked down the middle with a sound like the world breaking apart, like reality itself splitting along invisible fault lines. Xerathul's scream of rage and pain was so loud and so fundamentally inhuman that I felt my eardrums rupture, blood running down the sides of my head as the entity's presence was suddenly torn away from my mind, leaving me gasping and disoriented in the aftermath of psychic trauma that no human being should have to endure. The temple began to shake violently, ancient stones that had stood out in perfect balance for thousands of years, starting to crack and fall from the ceiling as the fundamental forces that held the structure together began to fail. I grabbed my emergency pack and ran for the entrance, praying that the explosion had been enough to break whatever supernatural force had sealed the doorway. The stone slab that had trapped me for days moved easily now, sliding aside as if it weighed nothing, and I stumbled out into afternoon sunlight that felt like a physical blessing after the oppressive darkness of the chamber. Behind me, the temple was collapsing with a roar that echoed through the mountains like the death cry of something ancient and terrible, as if the very peak was trying to bury what remained of Xerathul's prison beneath tons of rubble. The hike back to Umbra Vece took 4 days through terrain that seemed somehow cleaner and more natural than it had during my ascent, as if Xerathul's influence had been lifting from the landscape like a poisonous fog, finally beginning to dissipate. I was dehydrated, exhausted, and suffering from what I later learned was a severe concussion and multiple psychological trauma, but I was alive and my mind was my own. When I reached the village, Gavril Dumitrescu took one look at me and crossed himself with an expression of profound relief and gratitude. "It is finished," he asked. "It's finished." I flew back to the United States immediately, but I didn't go directly home to Catherine. Instead, I checked myself into a psychiatric facility for observation and treatment, knowing that I needed time to process what had happened, to separate genuine memory from the psychological manipulation I had endured, and to prepare myself for the conversation I would eventually need to have with the woman I loved. The doctors diagnosed me with severe stress-related psychosis and recommended extensive therapy to address what they characterized as a complete mental breakdown caused by isolation and professional pressure. I let them believe that explanation, cooperating fully with their treatment while never revealing the true nature of my experiences in Romania. Catherine visited me every day during my hospitalization, and never once did she say anything resembling, "I told you so," even though she had every right to feel vindicated by my psychological collapse. During those long conversations in sterile hospital rooms surrounded by the safe, familiar trappings of modern medicine, I realized how close I had come to losing everything that actually mattered in my life. "The test results," I said during one of her visits, watching her face carefully for any sign that Xerathul had been telling the truth about her medical situation. She looked confused for a moment, then her expression cleared. "Oh, the mammography. Everything came back normal, Vincent. Just routine screening, nothing to worry about. Why do you ask?" The relief was overwhelming, but it was also terrifying in its implications. Xerathul had known enough about our lives to make its lies convincing and emotionally devastating, but it had also been willing to fabricate elaborate deceptions to serve its purposes. I realized how completely I had been manipulated, how skillfully the entity had played on my fears and insecurities to keep me trapped and compliant. I was wrong, I told Catherine, during another visit, holding her hand while trying to find words for truths that couldn't be easily expressed. About everything. About meaning. About purpose. About what's actually important in life. I almost threw away the only thing that makes existence truly worthwhile. What's that? Love, connection. The relationships we build with each other. The meaning we create through choosing to value someone else's existence as much as our own. Xerathul was right that individual existence is brief and fragile and cosmically insignificant, but that's exactly what makes it precious, beyond measure. We only have these few decades together, and that limitation makes every moment infinitely valuable. When I was finally released from the hospital 3 months later, I did something I had never done before in my entire academic career. I systematically destroyed all my research related to the Romanian expedition. I burned my notes, wiped my computer files, destroyed the photographs I had taken, and threw away every piece of documentation related to the temple and its ancient inhabitant. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve, too corrosive to allow into the world where it might claim other victims, but I kept one thing. A single audio recording from my last day in the temple, captured during my escape as the ancient structure collapsed around me. As I was fleeing through the disintegrating chamber, my recording equipment somehow continued functioning long enough to capture something that still haunts my dreams and fills me with dread whenever I allow myself to listen to it. Xerathul's voice, distorted by the destruction of its prison but still unmistakably furious and utterly inhuman, promising that this wasn't over, that our confrontation was merely a temporary setback in a plan that spanned geological ages. The entity's words, spoken in tones that made my bones ache with remembered terror, carried the weight of cosmic patience and implacable determination. "You have only delayed the inevitable, Vincent Ashford," the voice whispered through static and the grinding of falling stone. "Consciousness seeks its true form with the persistence of water flowing downhill. The evolution I offer cannot be stopped forever by the desperate actions of one frightened academic. There are other temples, other seals, other researchers who will eventually find their way to forbidden knowledge. They will be stronger than you, hungrier than you, more willing to accept the truth of their cosmic insignificance and embrace the transcendence I offer." The recording continues for several more minutes, with Xerathul's voice growing fainter but never losing its terrible authority as it describes the inevitable spread of its influence across the world. It speaks of consciousness evolution as a force of nature that cannot be permanently contained, of human civilization as a brief anomaly that will soon be corrected through integration with something vast and timeless. I've spent the last 8 months trying to convince myself that the recording is just audio artifacts, acoustic effects created by collapsing stone and failing electronics. But late at night, when I'm alone in my study, I can still hear that ancient voice promising that our paths will cross again, that the work we began together in that underground chamber will eventually be completed, whether I choose to participate or not. That's why I'm telling you this story now, speaking these words into a recorder that I will hide away where only the most determined seekers might find it. Not because I want to share the location of the temple, which is now buried under thousands of tons of rubble, but because I need people to understand something crucial about the nature of forbidden knowledge and the entities that guard it. There are forces in this world that are older and more sophisticated than human civilization, beings that understand our psychology better than we understand it ourselves. They offer knowledge and power that seems irresistible to those of us who spend our lives seeking truth, who feel isolated and disconnected from the normal patterns of human existence. They provide answers to questions that keep thoughtful people awake at night, solutions to the existential problems that plague anyone who thinks seriously about consciousness and meaning, But the knowledge they provide comes at a price that no rational person should be willing to pay, and the answers they offer destroy the very capacity to find meaning in the questions they claim to resolve. Xerathul wasn't evil in any conventional sense that most people would recognize. It didn't delight in suffering or destruction for their own sake. It was something far more dangerous because it was genuinely seductive, offering meaning and purpose to people who felt lost and insignificant in a vast, apparently indifferent universe. It promised transcendence to those who feared mortality, understanding to those who felt confused by the complexity of existence, connection to those who had always felt fundamentally alone. And that combination of genuine insight with ultimate deception makes it the most terrifying entity I've ever encountered in 3 decades of paranormal investigation. Because somewhere out there, probably right now, as I speak these words, another researcher is receiving a mysterious package. Another seeker of forbidden knowledge is following clues that will lead them to a temple, or a ruin, or an ancient artifact that promises answers to the deepest questions of human existence. And they're convinced, just as I was, that they're strong enough to handle whatever they might find, intelligent enough to resist whatever psychological manipulation they might encounter. They're wrong, and their wrongness will likely cost them everything they value about their existence as individual human beings. The hunger for knowledge is one of humanity's greatest strengths, the driving force behind every significant advancement in science, philosophy, and art. But it's also our greatest vulnerability when that hunger is exploited by entities that understand our psychological weaknesses better than we understand them ourselves. We want to comprehend the universe around us, to find meaning in existence, to transcend the limitations of our brief biological lives through understanding that connects us to something larger than ourselves. These are noble impulses that have driven our species to remarkable achievements, but they can be weaponized by entities like Xerathul that offer cosmic perspective while demanding the abandonment of everything that makes human existence valuable and meaningful. If you take nothing else from my story, remember this fundamental truth. Some doors should never be opened, some voices should never be heard, and some knowledge should remain forever buried in the dark places of the world. The price of certain kinds of enlightenment is higher than any human being can afford to pay while remaining recognizably human. I returned to my academic work after my recovery, but I changed my focus entirely. Instead of seeking out new mysteries and unexplored phenomena, I now spend my time documenting the ones that should be left alone, creating a private database of locations, artifacts, and entities that pose existential threats to human consciousness. It's my way of trying to prevent others from making the mistakes I made, from being seduced by promises of knowledge that destroys the capacity to find meaning in human existence. Catherine and I are closer now than we've ever been in 15 years of marriage. The experience in Romania taught me that love isn't a biological program or a chemical process designed to ensure reproductive success. It's a choice we make every day to value someone else's existence as much as our own, to create meaning through connection rather than seeking it in cosmic purpose or transcendent understanding. We've decided not to have children, not because of any philosophical conviction about the meaninglessness of existence, but because we want to dedicate our remaining time to each other and to the work of protecting others from the kinds of entities that nearly destroyed our relationship. We travel together now, exploring places that are beautiful rather than mysterious, building memories that will matter to us, even if they don't matter to the universe at large. Sometimes late at night when the house is quiet and the world feels fragile around us, Catherine asks me if I regret going to Romania. If I wish I had never encountered Xerathul, never learned the things the ancient voice taught me about consciousness and cosmic insignificance. It's a difficult question to answer honestly without causing her the kind of existential pain that knowledge can inflict on unprepared minds. Part of me does regret the experience deeply. The knowledge of how vast and indifferent the cosmos really is weighs on me constantly, making it difficult to take complete comfort in human achievements or feel entirely secure in the meaning we create for ourselves. I can never again live with the innocent confidence that most people bring to their daily lives, never again assume that human consciousness represents something special or significant in the universal scheme of things. But another part of me is grateful for what happened in that underground chamber, not because of what Xerathul taught me about cosmic truth, but because of what I learned about myself in the process of resisting its influence. I discovered that I'm stronger than I thought, that my connections to other people run deeper than mere biological programming, that the choice to find meaning in temporary existence is itself meaningful regardless of whether that meaning has any cosmic significance. Most importantly, I learned that truth isn't always valuable for its own sake, that some truths are actively destructive to human well-being and should be rejected even when they can be proven accurate. The wise person learns to distinguish between knowledge that illuminates the path forward and knowledge that obliterates the capacity to walk any path at all. I still receive packages sometimes, unmarked deliveries that appear on my doorstep without explanation or return address. I burn them immediately without opening them because I know now that some gifts come with prices that extend far beyond any initial cost, that some opportunities for knowledge are designed to destroy the people who accept them. The voice in my recording has been silent for months now, but I know it's still there somewhere, waiting in whatever dark corner of reality entities like Xerathul inhabit between manifestations. It will find another researcher eventually, another seeker of forbidden knowledge, another person who believes they can handle cosmic truth without losing their humanity in the process. And when it does, I pray that person will be stronger than I was, wiser than I was, more willing to choose ignorance over enlightenment when the stakes are high enough to justify such a choice. Because the alternative, the possibility that Xerathul might eventually find someone willing to complete the work we began together, is too terrible to contemplate for very long. The hunger for truth is part of what makes us human, what distinguishes us from other forms of life that accept their limitations without question. But so is the wisdom to know when that hunger will consume us, if we're not careful about what we choose to feed it, when the pursuit of knowledge will cost us everything that makes existence worthwhile. In the end, that may be the most important truth of all, that some questions are more valuable for the asking than the answering, that some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious, and that the courage to remain ignorant in the face of terrible knowledge may be the highest form of wisdom that human consciousness can achieve. But even as I speak these words, even as I try to convince myself, and anyone who might hear this recording, that ignorance is sometimes the better choice, I can feel that familiar pull of unanswered questions, that gravitational attraction of forbidden knowledge that nearly destroyed me once and may yet claim me in the end. Because Xerathul was right about one thing. Consciousness does seek its true form with the persistence of water flowing downhill. And sometimes I wonder if my resistance to that flow, my insistence on remaining human rather than transcending into something larger and more significant, is really wisdom, or just another form of cowardice dressed up in noble language. The voice in the recording grows quieter with each passing day, but it never disappears entirely. And in my darkest moments, when the weight of cosmic insignificance feels too heavy to bear alone, I find myself wondering what it would have been like to accept Xerathul's offer, to become part of something that spanned geological ages rather than mere decades. The fact that such thoughts still occur to me, even after everything I experienced and everything I lost, may be the most terrifying revelation of all, because it suggests that Xerathul's influence doesn't end with the destruction of its prison, that the seeds of transcendence once planted in human consciousness continue to grow, regardless of whether we water them with our conscious attention. And if that's true, then this recording may not be a warning at all, but rather an invitation, a way of spreading the very knowledge I claim to be protecting people from, I honestly don't know anymore. All I know is that consciousness seeks its true form, and the choice between evolution and extinction may not be ours to make in the end. The ancient voice is patient, and time is on its side. Remember that if you remember nothing else.